What if I told you that one of history's deadliest massacres wasn't caused by a superior enemy? What if the real killers were ego, pride, and two men who despised each other so much they let their own soldiers die rather than work together? Picture this: over 80,000 Roman soldiers slaughtered in a single afternoon, bodies piling up along a riverbank, men drowning as they desperately tried to swim to safety. And the commanders? One of them fled while his troops were being butchered, and the other watched helplessly as everything collapsed around him. This is the story of Arausio, a catastrophe so devastating it nearly ended Rome itself. A battle where somewhere between 80 and 120,000 people lost their lives because two generals couldn't put aside their hatred for a single day. Now, to truly understand how Rome ended up in this nightmare, we need to go back a few years. Yet we need to understand the sheer terror that was gripping the ancient world at this moment. It's 105 BC, and something terrifying is happening in the frozen lands of northern Europe. Two massive tribal confederations, the Cimbri and the Teutones, have abandoned their homeland. We're talking about the region that's now Denmark and northern Germany. These weren't just warriors on the move. This was an entire civilization picking up and leaving, hundreds of thousands of men, women, children, and endless columns of wagons loaded with everything they owned, herds of cattle stretching to the horizon. Why did they leave? Nobody knows for certain even today. Some ancient writers mention catastrophic floods that destroyed their farmlands. Others talk about climate shifts that made the region impossible to survive in. Whatever the reason, these tribes were heading south, and Rome stood directly in their path. Now imagine you're a regular citizen living in Rome during this period. Word reaches the city that barbarian hordes are descending from the north. And here's the thing that really sent shivers down Roman spines. These tribes had already beaten Rome before. 7 years earlier, at a place called Norea, Roman legions had tried to stop the Cimbri. The result? A complete disaster. The Roman commander barely escaped with his life. The army was shattered, and the barbarians just kept coming. So when news arrived in 105 BC that these same tribes were now marching down the Rhone Valley in Gaul, approaching a town called Arausio, panic erupted. Because everyone understood what would happen if these tribes crossed the Alps into Italy. It would mean the end, the burning of cities, the enslavement of the Roman people. Total annihilation. Historians later called this period the Terror Cimbricus. The Cimbrian Terror. And that name tells you everything about the psychological state of Rome at this moment. So the Senate did what any desperate government would do. They mobilized everything. Not one army, but two massive forces. Approximately 80,000 trained legionaries. Another 40,000 auxiliaries and support troops. This was one of the largest military concentrations Rome had ever assembled in its history. But here's where things went catastrophically wrong. The two men commanding these armies absolutely despised each other. On one side, you had Gnaeus Mallius Maximus. He held the position of consul that year, which meant he was technically the highest authority in the Roman state. But Maximus had a problem. He was what the Romans called a novus homo, a new man, the first person in his family to ever reach such high office. He didn't come from the ancient noble bloodlines. He'd clawed his way up through talent and ambition. Down on the other side stood Quintus Servilius Caepio. He was a proconsul, which technically meant he ranked below Maximus. But Caepio came from one of Rome's oldest aristocratic families. He was a true patrician. And the idea of taking orders from someone he considered a jumped-up nobody? Absolutely unacceptable. His pride wouldn't allow it. Let that sink in for a moment. Rome is facing an existential threat. Hundreds of thousands of enemies are approaching. And the two commanders who are supposed to save the Republic can't even have a civil conversation. When the two Roman armies arrived near Arausio, Caepio made his contempt crystal clear. He refused to camp alongside Maximus's forces. Instead, He positioned his entire army on the opposite bank of the Rhone River. He literally put a river between himself and his fellow commander. No joint planning sessions, no coordinated strategy, no communication whatsoever, just two Roman armies is sitting on opposite sides of a river, waiting for a catastrophe. Now let's talk about what happened when the battle actually began. Before the main confrontation, the Romans sent out a reconnaissance force led by a legate named Marcus Aurelius Scaurus. His mission was straightforward: assess the enemy's strength, maybe open diplomatic channels, see if there was any way to avoid a full-scale war. The Cimbri weren't interested in talking. They annihilated the reconnaissance force and captured Scaurus alive. They dragged him before their king, a man named Boiorix. And here's the remarkable thing. Even facing certain death, Scaurus looked the barbarian king in the eyes and warned him. He told Boiorix that attacking Rome would be the worst mistake of his life, that Rome would make them pay. Boiorix had him executed immediately. After this incident, Consul Maximus attempted his own diplomatic approach. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a way to negotiate. Perhaps Rome could redirect these tribes elsewhere. Buy time. Find a solution that didn't involve massive bloodshed. When Caepio heard that Maximus was negotiating with the enemy, he completely lost control. In his mind, this was a scheme. If Maximus somehow pulled off a diplomatic victory, or worse, won a military triumph, the new man would receive all the glory. And that was something Caepio simply could not tolerate. So Caepio made a decision that would haunt Rome for generations, without informing Maximus, without any coordination, without any plan beyond his own ambition. He ordered his legions to cross the river and attack the Cimbri head-on. This wasn't strategy. This was suicide, driven by pure ego. Think about what he did. He threw his entire army at an enemy force that outnumbered them significantly. An enemy that was fighting for the survival of their families. An enemy that had already proven they could defeat Roman legions. The Cimbri couldn't believe their luck. Here was half the Roman force, attacking alone, completely isolated from support. They surrounded Caepio's legions like wolves encircling wounded prey. The slaughter that followed was absolute. Roman formations crumbled. Discipline collapsed. Thousands upon thousands of soldiers fell. And Caepio's camp? Yet he'd left it virtually undefended because he'd brought everyone with him for his glory-seeking attack. The Cimbri swept through it, taking everything of value. As for Caepio himself, he ran. While his men were dying, while the army he'd led into disaster was being systematically butchered, he fled to save his own skin. With Caepio's force destroyed, the Cimbri and Teutones turned their attention to Maximus's camp. And here's where geography became a death sentence. Maximus had positioned his camp with the Rhone River at his back. Under normal circumstances, this wasn't a terrible choice. It protected one side of the camp from attack. But when you're facing annihilation, when your defensive lines are collapsing, that river becomes a trap. The soldiers under Maximus's command had witnessed everything that happened to their countrymen across the water. They'd seen the massacre. They'd watched fellow Romans cut down by the thousands. And the psychological impact was devastating. When the barbarians attacked, morale shattered almost immediately. Roman defensive lines broke. Soldiers began to run. But there was nowhere to run to. Behind them was the river. In front of them were enemies intent on killing every last one of them. Thousands of legionaries tried to swim across the Rhone, most of them drowned. Heavy armor, exhaustion, and sheer panic pulled them under the water. Those who stayed on land were hunted down and killed without mercy. By the time darkness fell on that terrible day, somewhere between 80,000 and 120,000 people lay dead. Soldiers, camp followers, cooks, blacksmiths, merchants, anyone who had been traveling with those armies. To put this in perspective, this was comparable to, or possibly worse than, the Battle of Cannae, that legendary disaster where Hannibal had destroyed a Roman army decades earlier, when in a single afternoon, Rome had lost more men than many nations could field in their entire military forces. When news of the catastrophe reached Rome, the city descended into total chaos. There were no more armies to send. The path to Italy was wide open. If the Cimbri decided to march on Rome at that moment, nothing could have stopped them. But then something strange happened. Something that historians still debate to this day. Instead of pressing their advantage, instead of marching into Italy and finishing Rome forever, the Cimbri turned west. They headed toward Spain to plunder and raid. Why? Nobody really knows. Maybe they weren't interested in conquest, just resources. Maybe they underestimated how weak Rome actually was at that moment. Whatever the reason, this decision gave Rome something priceless. Time. Now let's talk about what happened to Caepio, that coward who fled while his men died. When he returned to Rome, expecting to maybe face some criticism, he discovered that the people and the Senate were out for blood. Literally. The fury directed at him was unlike anything seen in Roman politics. He was stripped of his Roman citizenship. Every single possession he owned was confiscated by the state. He was thrown into exile. Some historical sources say he died in prison. Others claim he spent his remaining years in poverty and obscurity, forgotten by everyone. Either way, and his name became synonymous with betrayal, arrogance, and catastrophic incompetence. Parents would invoke his name as a warning to their children about the dangers of pride. But here's the truly remarkable thing about Arausio. From that ash heap of disaster, something transformative emerged. Rome was desperate. They had no army. They had no commanders anyone trusted. And those barbarian tribes were still out there, and they could return at any moment. In their desperation, the Roman people did something technically illegal. They elected a man named Gaius Marius to the consulship for the second consecutive year. Roman law explicitly prohibited this. But in that moment, nobody cared about legal technicalities. Rome needed a savior, and they believed Marius was that man. Marius examined the situation and recognized a fundamental truth. The traditional Roman military system was broken beyond repair. Under the old model, only citizens who owned property could serve in the legions. The theory was that men with something to lose would fight harder and remain loyal, but decades of continuous warfare had devastated this property-owning class. Arausio had just killed tens of thousands more. Rome simply didn't have enough qualified men left. So Marius did something revolutionary. He opened the army to everyone. Even the poorest citizens with no property whatsoever could now enlist. The state would provide weapons. The state would provide armor. The state would provide training. And military service would no longer be a temporary civic duty. It would become a professional career with pay and pension. These became known as the Marian reforms, and they fundamentally transformed warfare forever. Marius standardized everything. He created the cohort system that would define Roman military organization for centuries. He established the eagle standard as the sacred symbol of each legion. It's something soldiers would die to protect. He took farmers and urban poor and turned them into the most disciplined fighting force the ancient world had ever seen, and the results spoke for themselves. A few years later, in 102 and 101 BC, Marius led these new professional legions against the very tribes that had humiliated Rome at Arausio. The Teutones were crushed at Aquae Sextiae. The Cimbri were annihilated at Vercellae. And the tribes that had terrorized Rome for over a decade were completely wiped out. The lesson of Arausio echoed through Roman history for generations. It demonstrated that even the mightiest military machine in the world could be destroyed not by a superior enemy, but by the arrogance and pettiness of its own leaders. Two men who couldn't set aside their differences for a single day condemned over 100,000 people to death. But it also showed Rome's remarkable capacity for adaptation. From catastrophic failure came revolutionary change. From the ashes of Arausio rose the professional legions that would conquer the known world. So here's my question for you. Had you ever heard of this battle before? Because most people know about Cannae and Hannibal. But Arausio, a disaster arguably just as devastating, often gets forgotten by history. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I want to know what you think about these events, about Caepio's betrayal. What's about what you would have done in that situation? And if this story gripped you, if you felt the weight of that tragedy and the transformation that followed, make sure you hit that like button. It genuinely helps more people discover these forgotten chapters of history. And while you're at it, subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive into the ancient world. I'll leave another video right here for you to continue the journey. Until next time.